So let's rip the Band-Aid off. What am I talking about? Well, what I'm talking about is the S5 Mark II with its phase detect autofocus, and people who recently bought the GH6 or the S5 original or any of these cameras feeling a little bit ripped off or tricked or deceived, or what, just having a little bit of buyer's remorse, I guess, might be the best way to put it. They feel like they've bought a brand new camera at, around the $2,000 mark. The S5 II comes out and it's still at that $2,000 mark, but it has phase detect autofocus. So I get that. I've had similar feelings. So let's try to figure out, unpack, if you will. I don't really love that term. Why people feel this way and how I've been thinking about it. So we'll get to the phase detect autofocus question later, but the first thing I thought of was just looking at the S5 II and the GH6 is the things the S series did well: low light, the best possible image quality, the best possible dynamic range, and just that full frame look, All of that is true about the S5 Mark II, but it's still true about the original S5, the original S1, the original S1H. Phase detect autofocus doesn't really change that. It just lets you have phase detect autofocus. Seems pretty simple, right? The reason I bring this up, though, is because Micro Four Thirds still has advantages over most full frame systems, especially in a certain price point. And that is the relative size, the relative weight, the relative cost. And yes, I know you can spend a lot on Micro Four Thirds if you want to, and not all of it is super small, not all of it is super cheap, but it's relatively small and relatively cheap. Please, if you know, point me to the cheapest full frame camera that does 4K 120 or nearly 6K 60 for $1,500 to $2,000 US, or just in general, and even bonus points if you can prove that it's like a native readout of 120 frames a second and it's not doing any pixel binning or line skipping or any of that weird stuff to achieve that frame rate. Because I know a lot of them, even to get 60 frames a second, have to crop or whatever. So Micro Four Thirds, the size, the weight, the features per dollar, and all the random bits and bops and all that stuff for the GH6, at least 100 megapixel photos handheld, all these things kind of just add up to have a more comprehensive camera in general than the S5 Mark II, or honestly any of the full frame cameras. If I had to pick a single camera still to this day to shoot with, it would probably be the GH6. That might just be a personal thing with me, but yeah, it does everything I need to, and its shortcomings where, the S series can come into play, the autofocus I think is fine. The low light can be helped with lights. The dynamic range issues, which are barely issues, but the slight disparity there can be made up with just a tiny bit of forethought or planning or lighting, or just don't matter that much to most videographers or cinematographers in most situations. But for me, it's just the high frame rates with no limits, with no crops, with no additional crops, no bit changes, anything like that, really. It's all 10-bit. It's higher frame rates in general. It's all 10-bit. There's no limits on the recording, and there's no additional crop. And yeah, the people are going to say, well, Micro Four Thirds is still smaller than the APS-C crop, but the fact is you can rely on the crop. It's not going to be cropping in certain modes. It's not going to be limited in that way. And for me, the crop on full frame is really unfortunate. I have a hard time working around it for my personal workflow and everything like that. These problems persist with the original S series and the new S5 Mark II. So why do I dislike this crop so much? Is one, you're forced to choose your field of view and blur, aperture blur, or the frame rate you want. Otherwise, you're locked to 30 frames a second, which is unfortunate. when you crop into 60, you lose what I consider to be the advantages of a full frame camera in the first place. Your wide angles are gone, first of all. Your full frame look is kind of gone because your aperture is, instead of a 2.8, it's like, what, a 4 or something like that. So you're losing that blur, you're losing your wide angle. The low light performance is 1.5 times worse, So is that on the level of the GH6 when it comes to noise performance? It's probably still a little bit better, but it's definitely a lot worse than in the full frame mode, and it becomes just a camera that's average in low light instead of amazing, which again is one of the main features of a full frame camera. And the quality remains the same. So whether it's Panasonic or anybody else's full frame cameras, your quality's going to be around the same or worse. With the GH6, your 4K 24, your 4K 60, your 4K 120, it's all going to look the same. Your 5.7K 60, your 4K 120, your 1080p 240 is all going to have the same crop factor. So your lenses and your focal lengths will be consistent, and you won't feel limited creatively with the GH6, unlike the S5ii. At least that's how I feel about it. So we've talked about pretty much everything so I guess it's time to talk about that autofocus now. It's super good on the S5ii. By all accounts, everyone I've talked to, every review I've seen, that autofocus looks really good. Looks really good. And I can't lie and say I don't want it. And I do, and I probably will get it. But what do I need autofocus for? YouTube maybe, but again, I think the GH6 is fine. I don't think anyone's going to be like, whoa, this is revolutionary. But this has been all with a fairly old lens, the 15mm 1.7, and basic settings. And I think it's fine. But it would be helpful for products. If I held something up, there's only a decent chance that it'll focus on it. Oh, it did. Okay. But it's unreliable. With autofocus, you want reliability. What else? Short films, feature films, music videos, corporate videos. Maybe I'd use it occasionally, but I tend to use cinema lenses and things like that for the work I really want to do with these cameras, which is creative narrative things and, commercials and corporate stuff. I don't really want to rely on autofocus for everything. What it could be good at is run and gun stuff like weddings and things where you're in an uncontrolled environment, where you want super reliable autofocus for when you think it might be faster than manual focus, and you don't need the human artistic touch that a manual focus pull provides. So I get all that for sure. Autofocus will be useful to pretty much anybody, and even if you plan on using it a little bit, there's other features in the camera that might be cool. But I always ask myself, what has prevented people from switching to Fuji or Canon or Sony or something if autofocus was that big of a priority? And now that Panasonic has one, I don't know what's preventing people from selling their stuff, even if it is at a bit of a loss, and going with these newer options with the autofocus. And yeah, autofocus sounds good, but I want every other feature Panasonic has to offer before I care about autofocus. And if they have autofocus too, great. I'll buy it when I can afford it, or I'll buy it now if it's essential to my work. And otherwise, I'll just keep rocking the GH6 with its, again, perfectly fine autofocus for most things. I'm watching you. And move on, So, yes, voice your concerns, put the comments out there. Let's let Panasonic hear us and let them know that we feel a little weird about how some of these product rollouts are going. But at the same time, you have to understand that this is how technology works. This is how it's always worked. Things improve, things get upgraded, things have new innovations. Companies like Sony back in the day or Fuji bring in phase detection and improve that phase detection over generations. And the last thing I really just think about is, well, last two things, I suppose. Final thoughts here. I'm just going to go out and put it out there, but I want you guys to just keep in mind that the GH6 was announced February last year. People got in their hands by March. It's been almost a year since the camera came out. It's been 2 or 3 years, maybe even more, since the S5 or some of the original S1, S1H came out. That's quite a while. If, the GH6 came out in March and, S5 ii came out in April, I'd be pretty salty too, I'm not going to lie. But it's been almost a year since this camera came out, and I think that's more than enough time. I think that's actually maybe just the right amount of time to go by for this new camera to come out and these new innovations to come out. The GH6 was in development for years. It came out. It was incredible, but so did the GH5. So did the GH4. And I'm certain people complained about those cameras as well. But these things happen. Technology comes out. Innovations happen. Camera companies don't just announce their next 5 years of cameras and let you plan things out. Maybe they should. Maybe we should encourage that to happen. But at the end of the day, that's not how the industry works for a lot of really good reasons. So, yeah, the GH6 is still amazing. I'm just going to say it. The GH6, the GH5, the GH5 Mark II. You can get great results with the S1H, the S1, the original S5. You could get great results with the GH4 or your iPhone. It's all relative, and it's all going to give you great footage if you know how to use it, if you know what you're doing. All cameras are doing now is just making our lives a little bit easier, giving us a little bit more bang for our buck. And yes, I understand, and I occasionally feel the same way, that I've got this original S5, I've got this GH6, and I feel like, man, if I knew the S5 Mark II was coming out with phase detect autofocus, would I be salty? Would I have regretted my decision? Do I regret my decision? And the answer is not really, because again, everything that was true in the past about full frame versus micro four thirds is still true. You can still get a Sony with good autofocus for $2,000, just like the S5 for $2,000. So why didn't you? And it's probably because you're like me. It's because you value everything else that Panasonic brings to the table over those other companies more than you value autofocus. But it's also hard to deny that now that autofocus is here with the Panasonic bodies, that's pretty appealing too. So I have a feeling that if it's that important to you, and if you want it that bad, you'll make it happen. You'll make it work. Otherwise, you'll do what you always have done, which is use these amazing cameras Panasonic makes, make great content, produce amazing wedding videos, shoot really awesome commercials, videos, photos, and someday maybe you'll get the S5 Mark II. I bet in a few months when the S5 IIX comes out, or when the S1H 2 comes out with phase detect autofocus, and higher frame rates and resolutions and no crops, and technology moves on even further, people are going to be selling their S5 Mark IIs. And you can get those then. And you know what? Those people are probably going to be disappointed as well that their S5 II is already obsolete. Just like we kind of feel with our GH6s right now. It's a cycle that endlessly repeats. And I encourage you guys, go back and watch old reviews and old videos and try to find old posts, and you'll realize pretty quickly this is kind of a tale as old as time. So do I wish they'd, put phase detect in the GH6? Yeah, it could have been interesting or cool, but the camera was already a year or two, a year late as it was, so I think the timing is just fine, and that's kind of how I felt about it. Is this cope? Is this me justifying things for a company? I'll let you be the judge, but hopefully this helped you guys kind of work through or relate to this experience you guys have been having. Because again, I have it too. I've had it too, but it just it doesn't bother me as much for all the reasons I talked about. But hey, this video is probably long enough as is. So if you guys made it this far in the video, thanks for stopping by. Keep using your cameras, keep making it work, and let me know if you think I should buy the S5 Mark II. I'm probably gonna buy it.